You're listening to From the Heart of the Church with Father Joseph Fowler from the Basilica of St. Michael the Archangel in Pensacola, Florida.
This week we come forward a bit in history to the beginning of the 4th century with St. Athanasius and one of the major controversies of the early church, which centered around who Jesus was, what really Jesus was. Maybe we imagine that during the time of the apostles that they simply asked Jesus these kind of questions, or they picked his brain. Certainly, I think we would want to do that. Lord, how does it really work for you to be God and man all at the same time? But we get a few hints in the Bible that their relationship was not so informal as that. Certainly there was an intimacy and a deep love between the apostles and Jesus, but it wasn't a familiar relationship. Even though they spent just about every waking moment together, there are still times where they're afraid to ask him questions, they're afraid to approach him.
Oh, really? Do give us an example.
One example of this is at the Last Supper, when Jesus announces in the 13th chapter of John's Gospel that one of them is going to betray him. And verse 22 of chapter 13 says, the disciples looked at one another at a loss as to whom he meant. One of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining at Jesus' side. So Simon Peter nodded to him to find out whom he meant. He leaned back against Jesus' chest and said to him, Master, who is it? That's verses 22 to 25 of chapter 13 of John's Gospel. But the others, even though they wondered and they had the question, they were unwilling to ask the question. So it may not be as informal a relationship as we might presume it to be at times. Be that as it may, the question arises later in the church about the nature of Jesus. He is Lord, he is God. He's obviously a man born of Mary as well. How does that work? How does it work together? What does it mean? Was his humanity at odds with his divinity? Was he able to sin? So many questions that come and are answered by the question of what Jesus actually is. This really plays out in the 4th century with what's called the Arian controversy, the Arian heresy. St. Athanasius was one of the most prolific writers and teachers against this heresy. It's a heresy that taught that the Father created the Son and that Jesus didn't share the same nature or substance with the Father. He wasn't divine in the same sense that the Father was divine. It's somewhat of an offshoot of Gnosticism, which we looked at in the previous episodes with St. Irenaeus, but it's really its own thing and becomes a huge controversy in the church that splits the church and the empire and creates so much strife and even bloodshed. So we'll learn a bit about that. But again, this is not so much an historical podcast as much as it is about looking at the treasures of the church. And what St. Athanasius writes, what he teaches, is a great treasure in the church's treasury. We're going to look at two specific writings of his, one on the life of St. Anthony and the other on the Incarnation. But it's important to understand the context in which he lived. Athanasius was born and raised in Egypt. And though he was educated in classical Greek education, he was in Alexandria. And this was a learning center of Christianity and of the ancient world in Egypt. But it was also a place of great strife and persecution at times in the church. In fact, when Athanasius was a young child, he saw so many of his contemporaries killed, arrested, persecuted for their Christian faith, a faith that he shared with them. So he grew up with an understanding that his faith could cost him his life. A contemporary of his as well, older than he, but definitely known to him, was Anthony, who was the father of monasticism, fleeing the persecutions in Egypt and desiring to go out and strike out into the desert to live a deeper life of full commitment to the Lord. Anthony went out to the deserts of Egypt and made his life there in solitude. Many people went after him to seek his guidance and seek his counsel and his blessing, to seek his intercession, but he became a known figure in the area, and Athanasius was somewhat of an assistant to him and a friend of his. We don't know too many of the specifics, but their relationship was a close one. So much so that when people, other monks in monasteries founded by Anthony's disciples, when these other monks wanted to know more about the founder, to know more about the master Anthony, they asked Athanasius to tell them about his life. And Athanasius wrote a brief biography on the life of St. Anthony. The other work that we'll look at is his work on the Incarnation. And this has so much to do with the teaching of the church about Jesus, what the Incarnation means. How does it work when we say the Word was made flesh? Certainly it's a mystery, but there are things that we can know and can state as truth in what we believe. This is also the time when the creed that we profess, the Nicene Creed, is being developed. It was in 325 at the Council of Nicaea, in an effort to unify the whole, really the empire as well as the faith. That profession of faith, the creed, was defined and specified. And it was a profession of faith that resolved a lot of the questions concerning the Arian heresy that had been raised. So before we get too far into that, I just want to step back and talk a little bit about Athanasius and his biography, what his life was, and the context of his life in Alexandria, and what it was like for him to grow up there.
What was Athanasius like?
He was a strong character. In fact, an axiom or an epitaph associated with him is Athanasius contra mundum, which is Latin for Athanasius against the world. He was unafraid to stand before whatever challenge stood before him, and in his youth developed great courage.
How did that come to be?
Well, however it came together, we know where it came together, and that was in Alexandria. He spent most of his life there. That's where he grew up, that's where he lived, that's where he studied, that's where he learned Christianity. Alexandria was a cosmopolitan city. It was a center of education. It had been founded by Alexander the Great, which is where it got its name. And there in Egypt, he was born right before the turn of the 4th century, so in the late 200s. And he grew up quickly because by 328, he was being named to the episcopate. He was made a bishop. And it was argued that he was too young at that time to become a bishop.
And how young was he?
He would have been just around 30 at the time.
Wow, that is young to become a bishop. He must have learned some hard lessons at an early age.
Early in his childhood, when he was about 6 or 7, there was a persecution that broke out in Alexandria, and he saw friends, neighbors, contemporaries persecuted and even killed. What a hard, rough cross to experience at such a young age, again, 6 or 7 years old. Those persecutions didn't end until 311, and so from 303 to 311, 8 years of his life, his early life, his childhood, he's surrounded by being at risk as a Christian. And so early on, he learned great courage in his Christian walk. In the introductory part of the St. Vladimir's Seminary Press edition of St. Athanasius' work on the Incarnation, the editor says this about this time in Athanasius' life. He had faced the possibility of martyrdom for himself, and he had made his own the faith for and by which the martyrs died. These persecutions in Alexandria led many people to flee into the desert. Even before the persecutions began, though, Antony had gone out to the desert himself and made a home for himself along the Nile in a quiet, solitary place. He went out to seek intimacy with Christ in the quiet and the solitude of a life of prayer. And though the persecutions in Alexandria likely influenced many people to follow after him and follow his example anyways, when the persecutions ended, many of them found the life in the desert to be such a blessing that they didn't return to their normal lives. They stayed in the desert. They stayed in this mode of prayer and abandonment to God. And I mean, this is really the birth of monasticism in the world. St. Athanasius himself tells us that he had been St. Antony's attendant for a long time. It's obvious from Athanasius' own writings, as he wrote a life of St. Antony, that he had a great reverence for Antony's reputation and life, and so himself desired this intimacy with Christ in a similar way. And it was about this time, in 313, that the Edict of Milan was issued. This legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire, of which Alexandria was a part, and so the persecutions were no longer possible with that legalization of Christianity. So Christians could enjoy their faith without risking their lives. Just a few years after that historic event, a priest by the name of Arius in Alexandria begins to teach this idea that Jesus did not share the same nature with the Father, that the Father was, in some sense, the creator of Jesus, and challenged the idea that Jesus himself was divine. And so begins this huge controversy over the nature of Jesus. Was he divine? Was he human? Was he both? Was there conflict? How does all that work? And the church works this out ultimately through the Ecumenical Council of Nicaea and the subsequent teachings of church leaders after that council. But it's not quite as simple as that either, because politically, the empire goes back and forth with Arian leaders and Orthodox Christian leaders, and Athanasius is sent into exile again and again and again as these powers shift back and forth. On both sides, the Arian emperors and the Christian emperors, there is a desire for unity, and so they want uniformity so that the empire can be united. They don't want to see division on any level in the empire so that their empire can be strong. Athanasius himself was present at the Council of Nicaea in 325, though he was only a deacon. It wasn't long after that he succeeded his boss, basically. He had been working as a deacon for the Patriarch of Alexandria, and he himself became the Patriarch of Alexandria until his death. In that role, he was exiled several times, I think 5 times altogether, as leadership changed hands in the empire between Arians and Christians. He was forever against the Arian heresy and a defender of the Orthodox Christian understanding of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so he becomes a real champion of the Trinity, and in some ways, the lone champion of the Trinity. This is where we get that epitaph, Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world. He's willing to stand up against anyone who corrupts the Christian faith. Why is this important for the Christian of today? Well, so many people have different ideas even today, about who Jesus is and what Jesus is. All of Islam recognizes him as a prophet, but not as God. Christianity, in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation and the splintering of Christianity into so many different denominations, really Christianity even can't claim a uniform belief in the divinity of Jesus. Most Christian denominations do, but it's not a necessary belief for all of them. But in reality, this question is huge and foundational because it makes a difference if Jesus came as God in the flesh, as God made man, to reveal himself to us. I mean, that's the whole basis of the Catholic understanding of how Jesus reveals himself, and that there's no debate over the teachings of Jesus. If Jesus taught it, if Jesus revealed it, because he is God, what is there to question? So the writings of St. Athanasius can be a great help to the modern day Christian in bolstering our understanding of Jesus as divine and solidifying our faith in the fact that God himself came to be incarnate, came to be made man. And so the beautiful work of St. Athanasius on the incarnation, on that very truth of faith, is a great treasure for us to delve into. It's also something that can help us appreciate the Eucharist at a deeper level, because we believe the Eucharist to be the body, the blood, the soul, and the divinity of Jesus, that it's his full divine and human presence really and truly there for us. So Athanasius' work on the incarnation, again, leads us into a deeper appreciation of that gift that we celebrate week in and week out, and some people day in and day out. The other work that we'll focus on in this episode and the next episode is St. Athanasius' biography of St. Anthony, as a reminder of the beauty of solitude and the beauty of silence, and how any one of us can enter into a profound life of prayer if only we open our hearts to God.
I've heard you say many times that finding time for prayer is simply a choice we need to make.
We have to make that space in our lives. Maybe we don't have to go out into the desert as Anthony did. Maybe we don't have to enter a monastery or become cloistered away from the world, but we can find those pockets of quiet and silence and solitude, and rather than avoid them, embrace them and enter into them and recognize that in that quiet place we can really encounter God. One of the other aspects of Athanasius' work on the incarnation that makes it such a beautiful expression of the teachings of the Christian faith is that it was written before these controversies really came to a head. So he's not writing this in response to heresy. He's not writing this in response really to anything. He's writing this as a way of illustrating the teachings of the Church. Athanasius is addressing the whole work on the incarnation to a certain Macarius, whom he refers to as a true lover of Christ. And he tells him that by reflecting and learning about the divine appearing in our midst, becoming flesh, the incarnation, that Macarius's own love and devotion to the Word will be increased. And so we can benefit in the same way from hearing what Athanasius has to say, that our love for God, our appreciation and belief and faith in the incarnation and in the fact that the divine, the Almighty, comes to walk among us as a man in Christ Jesus, can be strengthened. In the first section of chapter 1, which Athanasius dedicates to the creation of all things as a starting point for what he's going to teach on the incarnation, he says this:
"You must understand why it is that the Word of the Father, so great and so high, has been made manifest in bodily form. He has been manifested in a human body for this reason only, out of the love and goodness of his Father, for the salvation of us men.
Athanasius is reminding us that the whole reason for the incarnation, the whole reason that the Word becomes flesh, is out of love for the Father and his desire to save us. And he goes back to creation as being this event that comes about as a work of the Word. God speaks and creation happens. This Word, it's the Word through whom he made all things. This is the Word that becomes flesh. And he makes the point that it's no huge surprise that the Word that was the author of our creation is the same Word that's the author of our redemption and our salvation. In fact, when we consider the mystery of Jesus in his divinity and his humanity, it's not a stretch for us to think about, in a similar sense, how our own existence as embodied souls, we have a spiritual part of us, we have a human part of us, or a corporeal part of us, a bodily part of us, both human. How does that work together? Now, Jesus had body and soul as human, and he had his divinity as well. So it's not comparing the same reality to compare Jesus to us, but similar questions can arise. How does this work together? And we have a lived experience of being embodied souls. We have that spiritual part of us, we have that physical part of us, both of them good, both of them created by God, but understanding how they work together and experiencing how they work together and exist together in us can give us insight into how the divine and the human in Jesus coexisted in him. In section 4 of that same chapter, the first chapter, Athanasius talks about the why of the incarnation, why God would do this. And he points to our first sin, original sin, the sin of Adam and Eve in the garden. In section 4 of chapter 1, Athanasius says this:
It was our sorry case that caused the Word to come down, our transgression that called out his love for us, so that he made haste to help us and to appear among us. It is we who were the cause of his taking human form, and for our salvation, that in his great love he was both born and manifested in a human body.
In fact, when Athanasius describes the corruption into which humanity falls after that original sin, it sounds like an amazingly modern description of human sinfulness and human corruption. In section 5 of chapter 1, he says this:
Indeed, they had in their sinning surpassed all limits. For having invented wickedness in the beginning, and so involved themselves in death and corruption, they had gone on gradually, from bad to worse, not stopping at any one kind of evil, but continually as with insatiable appetite, devising new kinds of sins. Adulteries and thefts were everywhere. Murder and rape filled the earth. Law was disregarded in corruption and injustice. All kinds of iniquities were perpetrated by all, both singly and in common. Cities were warring with cities. Nations were rising against nations, and the whole earth was rent with factions and battles, while each strove to outdo the other in wickedness.
And so Athanasius poses the question, how could a good God ignore or be apathetic to the plight of his own creatures? Seeing them in such corruption, seeing them in such depravity, how could he let them continue or fall away and leave them to that fate? Well, he can't, and he won't, and he doesn't. And thus we have the incarnation. Athanasius argues that it would be unworthy of God for him to leave us in such a state. And although God had never been far away from his world or his creation, Athanasius tells us that he came into it in a new way. In section 8 of chapter 2, Athanasius tells us that God saw all of our transgression. He saw all of our sinfulness. He saw all of the depravity, all the darkness, and pitied us. He was moved with compassion, unable to endure the fact that death should have mastery over us. And instead, he comes in a human body. He comes to take as his own a human body, not just appearing human, not just showing up as the angels have done in the scriptures, looking like a human, but really and truly taking on our human nature himself so that he could redeem us. Just following that in section 9, he says this:
The Word perceived that corruption could not be gotten rid of otherwise than through death. Yet he himself, as the Word being immortal, and the Father's Son as such, could not die. For this reason, therefore, he assumed a body capable of death, in order that I, through belonging to the Word who is above all, might become in dying a sufficient exchange for all, and itself, remaining incorruptible through his indwelling, might thereafter put an end to corruption for all others as well, by the grace of the resurrection. It was by surrendering to death the body which he had taken as an offering and sacrifice free from every stain that he forthwith abolished death for his human brethren by the offering of the equivalent.
Athanasius uses the idea of human solidarity as kind of the glue that cements us to all of this. In other words, that just as all of us were broken by Adam and Eve's sin, by that original sin in the garden, so all of us were healed and mended by what Christ does at Calvary. So one reason for the incarnation is our salvation. That's obviously the primary reason for that. But Athanasius goes further in the next chapter, in chapter 3, to talk about the fact that God also comes to reveal himself to us. Yes, he comes to redeem us, but in Jesus, he reveals himself to us in a definitive way, in an unquestionable way. Who can tell us more accurately the truths of God than God himself? And so Jesus, the Word takes on flesh in Jesus to be able to do that to the full as a human. In chapter 3, section 11, Athanasius says,
He took pity on them, therefore, and did not leave them destitute of the knowledge of himself, lest their very existence should prove purposeless. For of what use is existence to the creature if it cannot know its Maker? And why should God have made them at all, if he had not intended them to know him? But as we have already seen, men, foolish as they are, thought little of the grace they had received, and turned away from God. They defiled their own souls so completely that they not only lost their apprehension of God, but invented for themselves other gods of various kinds. They fashioned idols for themselves in place of the truth, and reverenced things that are not, rather than God who is.
This is so applicable to our day and to every Christian in today's world, that we constantly face that temptation of giving ourselves to lesser things rather than opening ourselves to the goodness and the grace of God. As you listen to this, consider in your own life, what things in your life you place before God, even good things. If they come before God or come as a higher priority than God in our life, we refer to that as being disordered, that even a good thing can be out of order in where it should be in our life and what place it should hold in our life. And yet every single one of us has the capacity to open our hearts to God and enter into a prayerful communion with him at every moment of our existence. There's never a time when God is ignoring us or turning a deaf ear to us. He's always open to us, if only we open ourselves to him. How many lost opportunities do we pass through the day when we could be speaking to God, when we could be praying to God and turning our hearts to God, and yet instead we ignore him and busy ourselves with the responsibilities of this life and this world, and find such a frenzy of activity that we can even go weeks without thinking about God. God's choice to become incarnate, to become one of us, is a supremely optimistic choice for us, because he chooses to draw our attention back to our creation, to remind us that we're created in his image and likeness. And even if through our sin we've fallen away from that or we've corrupted that, he's going to renew that in us. Athanasius gives the example of a portrait that's been painted and has been stained or corrupted in some way, that the portrait's not thrown out, but whoever the portrait's subject is comes back and the portrait is refabricated, refashioned, repainted, so that its likeness can be what it was to begin with. And so too, that's what God does with us. He doesn't give up on us because we've corrupted ourselves through sin, but he comes to remind us through the incarnation, by becoming one of us, how good we can actually be. We can love as he loves. We can be as he is, perfect. The Word comes in Jesus and reminds us of the Father's love for us, reminds us of our dignity, reminds us of our creation, and all that we're called to be in this life and the next. He will not and never does give up on us. In section 16, Athanasius says this:
When then the minds of men had fallen finally to the level of sensible things, the Word submitted to appear in a body, in order that he, as man, might center their senses on himself and convince them through his human acts that he himself is not man only, but also God, the Word and wisdom of the true God.
And so it may not be immediately obvious from this passage, but one of the things that Athanasius is certainly pointing to is the fact that we can benefit so much from reflecting on the life of Christ in the Scriptures. We can see through the Scriptures his human acts and all the things that he did and the way that he lived and the things that he said and the miracles that he performed, all these things that he did as the God-man, as the divine human, he did for our benefit so that we can see and believe. So if you've fallen away from the habit and the practice of reading Scripture on a daily basis, you don't have to read the Bible in a day. You don't have to read even a whole chapter in a day, but just take a few verses of the gospel every single day and put before your eyes and the eyes of your heart and your soul the life of Christ. He's become flesh. He's become man so that we could see him and experience him and touch him and hold him and know him and hear him. And the way that we can do that in the modern world is through prayer and through the Scriptures that tell us what he did when he was here in the flesh. Another powerful way, in addition to reading the Scriptures, that we can renew our faith in Christ and grow in our faith in Jesus is to pray in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament. This is the real presence of his body, blood, soul, and divinity. And as we come into that presence, we come into the presence of Christ. And he can teach us, even in the silence of our prayer, he can teach us so much about himself. And finally, as a last point for this episode, one of the things that I find so marvelous about the Incarnation is the fact that Jesus proves in his very existence that there's nothing about our humanity that is incompatible with a full and complete communion with God's divinity. In other words, that Jesus, there was nothing imperfect about his humanity. And so as a human, he was fully able to be in complete communion with God, the divine. If that's true for him, it's true for us. Our sinfulness takes away from that, but we are fully capable in our perfect humanity of being in full and total communion with God. And that's the communion for which we've been created and called into existence in the first place. That's our destiny, if only we can accept it, if only we can live it. And so in the next episode, we'll look a little bit more at St. Athanasius' work on the Incarnation and then focus on the life of St. Anthony, which reminds us of the call that we have to open ourselves to prayer and the capacity we have to enter into full communion with God, who loves us so much that for us, he became man.
You've been listening to From the Heart of the Church with Father Joseph Fowler from the Basilica of St. Michael the Archangel in Pensacola, Florida. Learn more about the Basilica of St. Michael the Archangel in Pensacola, Florida at stmichaelbasilica.com.